January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls in silence. Not the gentle drift of a winter postcard, but thick, suffocating curtains of white that erase the horizon. German gunners crouch in their foxholes, breath visible in the frozen air, fingers numb around the steel of their weapons. The trees, what remains of them, stand like broken teeth against a gray sky. 4 weeks now, they have fought in this place, pushing westward through these forests in what their commanders promised would be the final great offensive. The Ghost Front, the Americans had called it before the attack. Now it is simply hell, measured in meters of frozen earth, and the thunder of artillery that never seems to stop. Oberstfreiter Klaus Becker presses himself deeper into the trench. He is 23 years old, a veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front, and he knows the sound of incoming fire the way a sailor knows the sea. But something has changed. In the past week, something fundamental has shifted in the nature of the barrage that falls upon them. The shells no longer merely strike the ground. They explode above, in the air itself, turning the sky into a steel ceiling of death. He has watched men torn apart in their foxholes, not by shrapnel that digs into earthworks, but by metal fragments that rain down from above, bypassing every protection, every lesson learned in years of war. He does not yet know the name of the thing that is killing them. He knows only that the Americans have brought something new to this ancient business of artillery, something that makes the bombardments of Stalingrad, of Kursk, seem almost merciful by comparison. This is not how it was supposed to be, the promise of Wunderwaffen. To understand the shock that rippled to the Wehrmacht in those winter months, one must first understand what German soldiers have been told, what they believed about their technological superiority. Since 1939, the Reich's propaganda machine had cultivated a mythology of German engineering genius. The unstoppable Panzer divisions, the Stuka bombers with their sirens of terror, the U-boats that prowled the Atlantic, the V-weapons that would rain vengeance upon London. Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. The very word carried the promise of inevitable victory through scientific supremacy. German artillery doctrine had been refined over decades, perfected in the crucible of the First World War's industrial slaughter. Their gunners were trained in mathematical precision, their ranging techniques considered the finest in the world. The 88mm flak gun had become legendary, equally deadly against aircraft and tanks. Even as the tide of war shifted, as the Eastern Front consumed entire armies, and the Western Allies gathered their strength, German soldiers clung to the belief that their weapons, their training, their iron discipline would prove superior to the numerical advantage of their enemies. The Americans, in this worldview, were industrial barbarians. Rich in material, yes, possessed of seemingly infinite factories and resources, but lacking the warrior spirit, the technical sophistication, the centuries of military tradition that defined the German soldier. They fought, as one Wehrmacht officer dismissively wrote, with money and metal, not with skill and blood. Their artillery was considered crude but plentiful, effective only because they could afford to waste ammunition in quantities that would scandalize a German quartermaster. This was a lens through which men like Klaus Becker viewed the war in those first weeks of the Ardennes offensive. They had broken through the American lines, scattered green divisions, recaptured ground. The Führer had promised that splitting the Allied armies would force a negotiated peace. They believed it was possible because they believed in the superiority of their arms and their will. And then the shells began to explode in the air above them, and belief shattered like glass under a hammer. The physics of death. What Klaus Becker and thousands of German soldiers experienced in the winter of 1944 and 1945 was the operational debut of the variable time fuse, known to American gunners as the VT fuse, and colloquially as the proximity fuse. It was, without exaggeration, the most significant advance in artillery effectiveness since the invention of high-explosive shells, and its existence had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The principle was elegant in concept, revolutionary in execution. Traditional artillery shells detonated in one of three ways: on impact after a time delay, or, rarely and unreliably, via mechanical time fuses that required gunners to calculate the precise moment of detonation based on range and trajectory. Against dispersed infantry, against moving vehicles, against aircraft, these methods were inherently inefficient. Impact fuses required a direct hit. Time fuses required perfect calculation and were easily thrown off by variations in temperature, powder quality, or atmospheric conditions. A shell that buried itself in mud before exploding wasted most of its energy excavating a crater. A shell that exploded too high scattered its fragments harmlessly. The proximity fuse solved this problem with a small radio transmitter and receiver built into the nose of the shell. As the projectile hurtled through the air, the fuse transmitted radio waves. When these waves bounced back from a solid object, the ground, a vehicle, a formation of troops, the fuse detected the increasing signal strength and detonated the shell at the optimum height for maximum fragmentation effect. Typically, this meant 15 to 30 feet above the target. At this altitude, the explosive force and shrapnel were distributed in a lethal cone that could not be evaded by hitting the ground or hiding in a shallow trench. The technical challenges had been immense. The fuse had to survive the shock of being fired from a cannon, accelerations of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity. It had to function reliably in temperatures ranging from Arctic cold to desert heat, in rain and snow and dust. It had to be small enough to fit in the nose of a shell, cheap enough to be mass-produced by the millions, and simple enough that it could not be easily copied if captured. American and British scientists had labored on the problem since 1940, pouring resources into miniaturized vacuum tubes, into shock-resistant components, into radio frequencies that would not interfere with each other when hundreds of shells were fired simultaneously. By 1944, they had succeeded. Production lines were turning out proximity fuses at a rate of over 40,000 per day. The 90mm anti-aircraft guns defending London and Antwerp against V-1 flying bombs were achieving kill rates that exceeded 80%, a figure that would have seemed like fantasy just years earlier. And now, in the snows of the Ardennes, the fuses were being used in artillery barges for the first time in the European theater. The effect was devastating. American gunners reported that proximity fuse shells were 5 to 10 times more effective against personnel than conventional ammunition. A battery that might have needed 100 impact fuse rounds to neutralize a target could achieve the same effect with 20 proximity rounds. Against German counterattacks, against troops forming up for assault, against observation posts and command positions, the new fuses turned American artillery into an instrument of surgical precision, though the surgery in question was measured in thousands of casualties. The experience of annihilation, in his post-war testimony, captured by American interrogators, Oberst Friedrich Muller, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, tried to articulate what it meant to be on the receiving end of proximity fuse bombardment. His words, stripped of military jargon, carried the weight of trauma. We had endured the Russian artillery. We knew what it was to be shelled by hundreds of guns, to have the earth itself seem to heave and break apart. But the Russian shells, terrible as they were, followed patterns we understood. We dug deeper. We dispersed our men. We moved positions after each barrage. These tactics, learned at such cost, suddenly meant nothing. The American shells did not need to hit us. They found us in our holes. They found us in our trenches. They found us when we tried to move, when we tried to stay still. There was no defense except to not be there at all, and in battle, that is the same as saying there is no defense. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had survived years of combat found their hard-won expertise rendered obsolete. The fundamental bargain of trench warfare, that depth and earth provided protection, had been broken. Men who went aground during a barrage discovered that the safest place in previous battles had become a killing zone. The shrapnel rained down into foxholes, into communication trenches, into the shallow scrapes that infantry carved into frozen soil. German after-action reports from the Ardennes document the collapse of unit cohesion under sustained proximity fuse bombardment. Companies that had maintained formation through conventional artillery fire broke and scattered. Officers lost control of their men not because of cowardice, but because any concentration of troops invited immediate and devastating response. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine, which emphasized mass and momentum in assault, became a formula for casualties. American forward observers, watching through binoculars and coordinating fire by radio, called down barges that seemed to anticipate German movements, that caught reinforcements as they moved up the line, that interdicted retreat routes and assembly areas with uncanny precision. The proximity fuse, combined with American superiority in communications and fire direction, had effectively multiplied the killing power of artillery by an order of magnitude, and German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to thinking of their enemies as materially rich but tactically unsophisticated, found themselves facing a weapon system that represented not just industrial capacity, but genuine innovation, the kind of innovation they'd been told only German science could produce. The intelligence failure. German military intelligence had failed catastrophically to anticipate the proximity fuse. This failure was not merely a gap in knowledge. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of American technological and scientific capacity. The Abwehr and Wehrmacht intelligence services had devoted enormous resources to tracking Allied weapons development. They knew about the Manhattan Project, though they underestimated its progress. They knew about British radar advances. They had captured examples of American tanks, aircraft, and small arms, and subjected them to exhaustive analysis. But the proximity fuse had been hidden behind layers of security classification that proved nearly impenetrable. American doctrine prohibited the use of proximity fuses over land where they might be recovered by the enemy until the situation was deemed desperate enough that the tactical advantage outweighed the security risk. The fuses had been used extensively in the Pacific theater against Japanese aircraft and in anti-aircraft defense of Britain, where the likelihood of recovery was minimal. German intelligence had received reports of unusually effective anti-aircraft fire, but without physical examples to examine, they could only speculate about the cause. The breakthrough in the Ardennes changed that calculation, with German armies threatening to split the Allied front, with American positions overrun, and the outcome of the battle in doubt. The decision was made to deploy proximity fuses in field artillery. The risk of capture was deemed acceptable given the stakes, and German soldiers did capture some. Unexploded shells were recovered, carefully excavated from the snow and mud, transported to rear areas for analysis. German scientists and engineers examining the fuses found themselves confronting a device that seemed to violate their assumptions about American technical capability. The miniaturization was extraordinary, vacuum tubes smaller than anything in German production. Precision manufacturing that suggested industrial processes the Reich could not match. Design philosophy that prioritized reliability and mass production over individual craftsmanship. One German engineer's report survives in the archives, translated after the war. His frustration is palpable. The device is crude in concept but exquisite in execution. It does not attempt to be perfect. It attempts to be good enough, in sufficient quantity, delivered rapidly enough that perfection is irrelevant. This is American engineering in microcosm, the acceptance that overwhelming adequacy defeats precise scarcity. What do you think would have happened if Germany had developed this technology first? Would it have changed the course of the Ardennes offensive, or was the outcome already determined by broader strategic factors? Share your thoughts below. The doctrine of abundance. The proximity fuse was not merely a weapon. It was an expression of philosophy of war that the Wehrmacht, even in its final months, struggled to comprehend. Consider the economics of the device. Each proximity fuse cost approximately $18 to manufacture in 1944, roughly equivalent to $300 in modern currency. This was not a trivial expense. A single artillery barrage might expend thousands of fused shells, representing an investment of tens of thousands of dollars in a matter of minutes. For comparison, a German 10.5 centimeters high-explosive shell cost a fraction of that amount. But the American calculation was different. If a proximity fuse shell was 5 times more effective than a conventional shell, and if American factories could produce them in unlimited quantities, then the increased cost per round was irrelevant compared to the reduced costs and casualties, in time, in tactical complexity. American commanders could afford to use ammunition as a substitute for soldiers' lives. They could afford to obliterate a suspected enemy position with 100 rounds rather than sending infantry forward into uncertain danger. They could afford to waste shells on empty coordinates if it meant certainty when contact was made. This abundance extended far beyond artillery. German soldiers occupying captured American positions found warehouses full of rations, ammunition, medical supplies, clothing, material that seemed lavish to men whose own supply lines were measured in horse-drawn wagons struggling through mud and snow. An American infantry company expected hot meals brought to the front line. American soldiers received cigarettes by the carton, chocolate bars, coffee. When American equipment broke, it was often discarded and replaced rather than repaired, because replacement was faster and the supply chain could sustain the waste. To Wehrmacht veterans who had learned to hoard every rifle round, to stretch meager rations, to strip dead enemies for boots and coats, this profligacy seemed both wasteful and terrifying. It spoke to an industrial capacity that could not be defeated, a civilian economy that had been mobilized without breaking, a society that could produce weapons and butter simultaneously while Germany starved and bled. The proximity fuse became, in the minds of German soldiers, a symbol of this impossible abundance. It was not enough that the Americans had artillery. They had artillery that did not miss, that could not be defended against, and they had it in quantities that turned the sky itself into an envelope of death. It was not enough that they had air superiority. They had it so completely that daylight movement invited annihilation. It was not enough that they had supplies. They had so many supplies that they could afford to use an $18 fuse on a single shell fired at a single target in a war that consumed millions of rounds per month. The admission, after the war, in the captured documents and interviews that Allied intelligence teams compiled from Wehrmacht prisoners and surrendered officers, a pattern emerges. German military professionals, freed from propagandist constraints, spoke with remarkable candor about the weapons that had defeated them. The proximity fuse appeared again and again in these testimonies, often unprompted. General d'Artillery Walter Warlimont, who served in the OKW operations staff, told his interrogators, the proximity fuse was worth more to the Americans than any 10 conventional innovations. It transformed their artillery from a blunt instrument to a precise tool. Our own artillery, excellent as it was in training and doctrine, could not compete, not because our guns were inferior, but because their shells could do what ours could not. General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorf, who served as intelligence officer for Army Group Center on the Eastern Front before his transfer west, offered a more strategic assessment. We knew the Americans were rich. We did not know they were clever. The proximity fuse revealed that they had married their industrial capacity to genuine scientific innovation. This combination, which we had believed was impossible, that we had built our entire strategy around them not achieving. This was what defeated us, not their numbers alone, but their numbers multiplied by their ingenuity. These were not the words of broken men seeking excuses. They were professional military officers attempting to understand how their armies, battle-hardened and tactically proficient, had been systematically dismantled. The proximity fuse stood out because it represented a category of surprise, a weapon that was not merely an incremental improvement, but a fundamental change in capability, one that German commanders had not anticipated and could not counter. In the final months of the war, as Allied armies pushed across the Rhine and Soviet forces closed on Berlin, German artillery officers issued desperate instructions to their men about how to minimize casualties from proximity fuse bombardment, disperse more widely, move constantly, avoid any concentration of troops, dig deeper, even though they knew depth provided no real protection when the shells burst overhead. These instructions were the equivalent of telling soldiers to dodge bullets. Tactically sound in theory, impossible to execute under sustained fire. The proximity fuse had done what German planners had feared most. It had invalidated years of tactical doctrine, rendered obsolete the hard-won lessons of defensive warfare, and done so in a way that could not be copied or countered in the time remaining. Even if German scientists had successfully reverse-engineered the fuse, and they tried, the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful quantities no longer existed. The factories were bombed, the supply chain severed, the raw materials unavailable. The weapon required the kind of abundant, undamaged industrial base that only the United States possessed. The sound of inevitability. Klaus Becker survived the Ardennes. He survived a retreat across Germany, survived the final desperate defense of Berlin's outskirts, survived a surrender to American forces in April 1945. In his pocket when he was captured was a small piece of metal, a fragment of shrapnel from a proximity fuse shell, edges jagged, metal twisted by the force of explosion. He had kept it. He told the American sergeant who processed him into the POW cage. As a reminder of what? The sergeant asked. That we were wrong, Becker replied in broken English. About everything. The proximity fuse was not the reason Germany lost the war. No single weapon, no matter how revolutionary, determines the outcome of a conflict that spanned continents and consumed nations. Germany was defeated by strategic overreach, by the industrial might of enemies it could not outlast, by moral bankruptcy that corroded purpose, by 1,000 tactical and operational failures that accumulated into catastrophe. But the proximity fuse was a symbol of why defeat was inevitable. It demonstrated that American abundance was not mere quantity without quality, that democracy's messiness could produce scientific marvels that dictatorship's focus could not match. It showed that the Wehrmacht's tactical proficiency, real as it was, could be overwhelmed by enemies who changed the fundamental rules of engagement. It proved that technology and innovation were not the exclusive province of German engineering, that the industrial democracies could outthink as well as outproduce the Reich. German gunners admitted this in the candid moments after surrender, in the testimonies they gave to historians, in the memoirs they wrote decades later when the propaganda had faded and truth could be spoken. They admitted that the proximity fuse had turned artillery into a new weapon, not merely improved, but transformed into something against which their training and experience provided no answer. There's a mathematics to modern war, a calculus of fire and steel that determines victory independent of courage or will. The proximity fuse altered that calculus fundamentally. It multiplied the effectiveness of artillery by factors that made numerical superiority into overwhelming dominance. It turned defensive positions into killing grounds. It made the concentration of force, the fundamental requirement of successful tactics, into an invitation for annihilation. And behind this single innovation stood the specter of an American military-industrial complex that was just beginning to understand its own power. The same laboratories that produced the proximity fuse were working on radar-guided bombs, on the first computers, on jet engines and guided missiles, and, in the deserts of New Mexico, on weapons that would render conventional warfare obsolete. The same factories that turn out 40,000 fuses per day were producing aircraft by the thousands, tanks by the tens of thousands, ships faster than they could be sunk. German soldiers had entered the war believing in the superiority of their arms and their iron. They ended it confronting the reality that American democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, had out-organized them, out-innovated them, and out-fought them with weapons they had not imagined were possible. Epilogue: the weight of a small thing. Years after the war, a German veteran visited the United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground. He stood for a long time in front of a display case containing a cutaway proximity fuse, the miniature vacuum tubes visible in cross-section, the mechanical precision of its construction exposed. A docent approached, asked if he had questions. "I saw these," the veteran said. "In Belgium, in the Ardennes." "You were there?" "Yes. We thought we were winning at the start. We thought we were better soldiers, with better weapons. Then these—" He gestured at the fuse. "Then these began to fall on us like rain that killed." The docent nodded. "They changed artillery forever." "No," the veteran said quietly. "They changed how we understood the enemy. We thought the Americans were rich but unsophisticated. We thought they won with numbers alone. This small thing—" He tapped the glass. "This small thing taught us we were wrong, that abundance and intelligence together are more powerful than scarcity and will. That is a hard lesson to learn while the sky is falling on your head." He left without saying more, but in his words was an admission that echoed across the testimonies of a generation of German officers. The proximity fuse had not merely been a weapon. It had been a revelation of American capability, of the power of democratic innovation, of the fundamental truth that wealth applied with intelligence creates advantages that courage and discipline cannot overcome. In the mathematics of war, the proximity fuse was an inflection point, a change in coefficient that altered every subsequent calculation. It proved that the future would be shaped not by nations that perfected 19th century virtues of martial valor, but by those that could marry science and industry, abundance and innovation, democratic messiness, and focused application of resources. The small thing weighed less than a kilogram. It cost $18. It exploded in the air above a frozen forest and taught a generation of soldiers that the world had changed, that the old certainties were obsolete, that the side with superior technology wedded to unlimited resources would write the future in ways that blood and iron alone could not prevent. German gunners admitted the truth because it could no longer be denied. American proximity fuses had turned artillery into a new weapon, and in that admission lay the recognition of a larger defeat, not merely of armies and tactics, but of the ideology that had promised victory through will and racial superiority. The fuse proved that democracy could outthink dictatorship, that abundance mattered, that the messy, chaotic, industrial democracy they had been taught to despise possessed capabilities they could not match. The snow fell silent in the Ardennes eventually. The guns ceased. The soldiers went home. Those who survived carried with them the memory of shells that burst in the air above them, of a technology that had seemed like something from an impossible future, of the moment they understood that the war was not lost in a single battle, but in the vast differential capacity between societies, one that consumed itself in conquest, one that turned its factories into engines of precision death without breaking stride. That differential, measured in $18 fuses produced by the millions, was a weight that tipped the balance of history. And German gunners, honest in defeat, admitted what they had witnessed. What they had witnessed was the future. And the future belonged to those who could afford to make the sky itself lethal reliably at scale, and do so while the civilians ate chocolate and listened to jazz. That is the lesson of the proximity fuse. Not merely that technology matters, but that the society capable of producing such technology in quantity, in quality, with the logistical sophistication to deliver it to the front and the tactical doctrine to use it effectively, that society cannot be defeated by valor alone. The German gunners knew this. In the end, stripped of propaganda, facing the evidence of their own experience, they admitted it. And in that admission lies one of the quiet, terrible truths of the Second World War. That industrial democracy, for all its compromises and inefficiencies, possessed a capacity for innovation and production that totalitarianism could not match. The proximity fuse was proof. The sky bursting with time death was proof. The testimony of soldiers who survived it was proof. The proof weighed less than a kilogram, but its weight measured the difference between victory and defeat, between the past and the future, between ideology and reality. The snow has long since melted in the Ardennes. The forests have grown back. But the lesson remains, carved into history by the testimony of men who learned it while the sky fell upon them in precisely detonated fury. They learned that abundance, paired with ingenuity, changes everything. They learned that the future cannot be conquered by those who misunderstand it. They learned and admitted that they had been wrong. And that admission, more than any single battle, marks the true defeat of the Wehrmacht's worldview, the recognition that the war had been lost not merely in tactics and strategy, but in the fundamental capacity to innovate, to produce, to apply science to the terrible work of war faster and better than their enemies could match. The proximity fuse, $18, less than a kilogram, the thing that made the sky lethal, the thing that German gunners admitted changed everything, the thing that proved, in the end, which society would write the future. What do you think separated the Allies' technological success from Germany's wonder weapons programs? Was it resources, scientific freedom, or something else entirely? Let us know your perspective in the comments.